Welcome back, MTG Joe here. Today we are going to give you a primer on all things needed for the upcoming Standard Metagame Challenge. We're going to go over a number of top performing decks that have been putting up results in the format, things to consider, and options that you might want to take to the event itself. As always, I encourage folks, as you're playing through the event, if you're able to get the 7-0, win those 30 packs, make sure to drop a deck list, share it with the community. We try to build it up here in terms of having a bunch of community-driven content, as well as just like sharing the success results. I always try to feature, like the latest video I did was showcasing someone I was speaking to who had a lot of success and got to #1 Mythic with a Madness deck in Historic, so kind of featured and showcased them that way. So if you do have success, we want to celebrate it as well, so make sure to kind of drop what you're doing well with. So we are going to cover over popularity of decks, and then we'll go into a bunch of different deck lists. I have probably like 10, 12 to go through. And we'll just jump into it. As always, we're going to predominantly get our data from Untapped.gg, what you see on the screen. Aggregates users' win rates, including your own. It's a good, cool tracker. Gives us a whole bunch of stats. The link for Untapped is in the video description. And then I will paste all these deck lists so you can copy paste them to your heart's content. And before we jump in, as always, we do this content weekly for every format on Arena: best of 1, best of 3, Historic, Explorer, Timeless, Alchemy when it's relevant, stuff like that. We're trying to hit 15,000 subs on the channel. We're just shy of 12,000. Hopefully we hit 12,000 by the end of the weekend after the Metagame Challenge, but trying to hit 15,000 by June. So if you haven't subbed, free, easy, helps with the channel. Likes and comments go a long way as well, just to help with our YouTube algorithm overlords. But jumping in, Standard. So what are we looking at in Standard? Boros Convoke currently. So this is popularity of the day. It's just volume of games. What decks are most played, not necessarily the highest win rate. Boros Convoke's just a little under 11%. 10% range, we have like Golgari Midrange, Azorius Control, Dimir Midrange, Esper Midrange kind of falling into that same bucket. And then kind of a tier down, we have Mono Red, the 4-color Reanimator, which are the Slogurk decks, and then 4-color Domain, which is like the domain control attracts a kind of ramp piles. With the prevalence, I do think the various Slogurk decks are strong. It's just they're hard to play. So the win rate doesn't necessarily correlate to their effectiveness. I think in general, something that a lot of folks have been skipping on the last few weeks has been Graveyard Hate. I think that's worth having your like Unlicensed Hearse, your Soul Guide Lantern, whatever it may be, just some option in the sideboard to bring in into those matchups. Just kind of looking at trends, we see like Boros falling down a bit. Similarly with Azorius Control, we're seeing slight increases in the mid-range decks, including like the Slogurk deck, which is kind of picking up, and then Mono Red Aggro. Longtime viewers of the channel know I love Mono Red. It's my go-to deck. We played it last week or 2 weeks ago in the Pizza Box Open. I lost my winning in top 8, finished 4-3, 5-2 would have snuck me into the 8th place. But that was like a 100-person tournament. I play a lot of Mono Red across various formats. I've hit #1 Mythic in the past with a variation of Mono Red. So I'm going to say Mono Red for the end. We're not going to use Untapped because I think the versions of Untapped, they're very poorly built. The mana, like the sideboards aren't very well built, and they're just not built with the notion of what the meta is right now. So I'm going to kind of go through a version of my list that I think is a little bit better, and then suggest some changes from recent kind of meta shifts. But we are going to look for the last week of data, Platinum to Mythic, because a ladder reset around this time. Don't focus so much on the win rates because some of them are smaller populations, but it's more just to kind of see what the archetypes are and what folks are going to be bringing. So we're going to cover a lot of them. There'll be a lot of different types between aggro, midrange, combo, and control. So there hopefully is something for everyone here. And we're going to start off with Azorius Control, 80% win rate over 36 games, smaller sample size, but the control archetype is very prominent towards the top of the ladder. What's interesting in this version, and you'll see some of them, will be on Jace main board. Some will be very creature light. Some will be upwards of 4 Hornlock Whales. But kind of the core of the deck and what we've got recently is No More Lies, as well as Deduce, that increases the density of powerful 2-mana spells. This version here is also playing Disruption Protocol as kind of a counterspell at home. You make tokens with like Deduce. There's a lot of get lost going around, so you can also tap down stuff like that for value. Temporary Lockdown is kind of the main draw of going blue-white control right now, given that there's so many low-to-the-ground aggressive decks. In part, this is how I'm also recalibrating my Mono Red deck, is you incidentally get hit based on stock versions, with temporary lockdown, them trying to target like the Convoke decks and stuff like that. This version here has the Chrome Host Seed Shark main. You typically see this in the sideboard. Fine inclusion in the main. This one's a little bit more threat dense, I would say, with the Ezrim in the main, as well as a single copy Hornlock. Sweeper package of Farewell Sunfall. Your Emperor's Deluge is pretty common in that case. The mana base here, you have some Field of Ruins. I think if you're going to be playing Control, it's critical you have these, as Myrex can go quite the distance against you. Myrex and Restless Anchorage as well in the mana base for utility spells. You have Edenix, which can shut off graveyard interaction and kind of protects you from that sense. Notably, this stops you from targeting, but the Slogurk, so with Slogurk you can't target the lands, but with the kind of, I forget the name of it, the Aftermath Analyst, it's return all, so it's not a target, so this does not shut that off. So one of the considerations, if you're planning on using Dennick as more of a graveyard hate piece, it can also be brought in against the aggressive decks because of it's a life linker, but just keep that in mind that it won't necessarily get rid of the Aftermath Analyst. Doorkeeper Thrall shuts off the ETBs of lands and creatures, good against the Convoke matchup, good against Domain, stuff like that. Various counterspells, Cryptic Coat, also nice just as another threat out of the board. Lockdown's main. Tashawn is really good against like various, say, Leyline Binding, other Planeswalkers, the ramp decks, stuff like that. And then Jace is really good in the mirror, and then it's also good against the Domain matchups. Golgari Midrange is the next one up, 73%. So this is the deck that knocked me out of the top 8. So here are my thoughts. I personally I would play Dimir over Golgari. I just like the counter spells better than the green cards, in my opinion. But I know a lot of people really like the Golgari decks. The draw of Golgari, you get Mosswood Dread Knight, just a recursive threat, draws you cards, tramples that goes over a lot of the small tokens in the format. Being a black-based deck, you're going to see a lot of the commonality of like your cut down, go for the throw, Deep Cavern Bat, Bitter Triumph, Breacher, kind of these top-end cards, Virtues in some numbers, Gix Command, Alkazlots, Shellys. But with the green, you're also going to get Sharp-Eyed Rookie, scalable card that gets bigger with your other spells, can easily become a 4/4 in this deck, potentially even a 5/5 with a Timely Shelly. Vigilance, and then provides you some card advantage as well through the Investigate. Sentinel the Nameless City, another way to create some map tokens. Glissa is very strong in combat, also incidental enchantment hate. Where Golgari is better than Dimir. Obviously, you have a lot of answers to things like Leyline Binding, any sort of enchantment-based spells that might exist. The Restless Cottage in here in the mana base, a couple caverns as utility lands as well. Your sideboard, you're going to get access to various removal spells, Hand Hate, Pick Your Poison, and Terra Sunder, very flexible cards. Choking Miasma was a card that just absolutely rocked me in our game. Buff your team minus theirs, really good against the Convoke decks, stuff like that. Lily versus Control, Path to Peril for aggressive decks, Tranquil Foe back, very flexible, also Graveyard Hate, and then Gix Command is more sweepers. Moving on, said Convoke list, 71%, and this list here, if you're not familiar with Convoke, it's very similar to the Pioneer version and Explorer, a lot of kind of overlapping cards, but Novice Inspector, Voldaren Aperture, turn 1, make an artifact, turn 2, Gleeful Demolition said artifact, and then you get like value from Warden of Inner Sky to tap to start getting value. You can Convoke as early as turn 2 with Knight Errant of Eos for card advantage. This version here is going heavier on the Regal Bunnicorns in addition to Resolute Reinforcements. No War Leader's Call in this version. Some lists have forgone on it for Sanguine Evangelist just because it is another threat for the Knight Errant of Eos, as well as Gateway Express in this version here. You'll sometimes see the War Leader's Call, you'll sometimes see Gate of the Express. The Gate provides you some removal and a fairly easy to activate and solve case that gives you an Anthem effect similar to the War Leaders. War Leaders is able to kind of stick some incidental damage later in the game. This deck is quite soft to temporary lockdown, and the mana base is pretty terrible for Boros. So that's, I don't know, that was my always thing. I lost more games to the mana base than I did to anything else. Lithomantic Barrage, blue and white things, destroy evil for big things. War Leader's Call, I'd probably bring in against Control, or just when you need to get slightly bigger than your opponent's stuff. This just has another way to kind of provide reach. It's pretty easy swap with control, get rid of the case, bring in War Leader's Call. Virtue just lets you play a flash game, kind of bigger as well. And then Wedding Announcement is good against like the mid-range. So you can kind of shift up. When your opponents are going to be bringing in more removal, you can kind of scale up. Other cards you might want to consider here are things like Obliterating Bolt. You can go Lightning Flare, or the Kicker Boros card, I forget its name. That deals X, where X is the number of creatures you control. That sometimes sees play. Just kind of various effects like that if you want more targeted removal, but this version here is just looking to go a little bit grindier in mid-range when your opponent's bringing in lockdowns and stuff like that. Dimir Midrange, 65%. There's a lot of different kind of versions of this, but kind of the core is cheap flyers, things like Spyglass Siren, Deep Cavern Bat, Fairy Mastermind, Malcolm into a Gix package. That provides you a lot of card advantage, evasive bodies, and this one lets you play kind of tempo elements. So you still have your removal package, but you can also supplement it with counter spells. Tashana's in here as a way to kind of fizzle out activated abilities, and then Shelly at your top end. Some of the versions will play Alcazats. You might see some with Invasion of Amonkhet. There's a lot of different takes of how you want to approach the deck itself. Myric's in here, Restless Fence as well. Your sideboard, again, just various types of removal spells, duresses for hand hates, more counters were relevant, Planeswalker package to be more grindy, similar with Alcazats, and then Gix Command as a sweeper. The one thing I would say kind of missing from here is some graveyard hate. I would probably look to find some elements of one or two, like Unlicensed Hearse probably goes a long distance, I would say. By that or Soul Guide Lantern, something of that nature. Azorius Mentor, speaking of a deck that you want graveyard hate averse. So this deck here is leveraging both Monastery Mentor to make you a whole bunch of tokens, so you can go very wide with this deck, or you can go very tall with Haughty Jin. That gets bigger based on the number of instant sorceries in your graveyard. How you're playing this deck is you're basically milling yourself over, looting, trying to put cards into your graveyard, specifically any of these, and then you either play Recommission or Helping Hand to reanimate them. Otherwise, the deck's got a bunch of cantrips, cheap interaction spells, card draw spells, protection spells with like March of the Swirling Mist. You'll sometimes see Ledger Shredder also get played in these lists, but you'll see at the minimum Picklock Prankster as well as the 2/3 drops. Sideboard, just various removal spells, counter spells, the Thrall in here. You have some sweepers as needed. You can become basically like a control style deck. Knockout Blow, very good against the red-based aggressive decks as well. Moving on, we go to Domain Control, 64%, and a lot of these lists have basically become a green-white deck that is splashing Atraxa. Quick coffee break. Sorry, lots of talking. And then you're leveraging Cavern of Souls, which really helps because Disdainful Stroke was a big card that saw play in here. One other addition, I've seen a lot of the lists shift to have temporary lockdown main in addition to depopulate, just giving you more answers. Your sideboard here, you have like some cheap removal, some counters, Chrome Host, just more kind of removal spells, Tashana's Tidebinder for activated abilities, and Obstinate Baloth for either heavy discard decks like Liliana or against like heavy aggressive decks. Again, you may want some graveyard hate. You may want also, Jace typically sees play in the sideboard. So if you're anticipating more domain ramp, Jace is a good card as a mirror breaker because a lot of times both decks are drawing so many cards and they can, with all the sweepers and the removal, they can answer everything like that. So it's a way to kind of get around that. You mill them out. Simic Artifacts, Simic Cookies, so 60.8%. So this deck's also got incidental graveyard hate in the main, thanks to Agatha's Soul Cauldron. A lot of activated abilities in this deck, things like Surge Engine, they can become unblockable, give your other things unblockable if it's exiled under the Cauldron. Tough Cookie can animate other artifacts. You have Teething Wormlet that gets bigger. Spyglass Siren makes artifacts. Ginger Blue can become unblockable. The new case lets you kind of get another Ensoul style effect similar to Zoetic Glyph. And then you have your 3 drops here that both make artifacts in various capacity. This is another deck that incidentally gets hit pretty hard by the temporary lockdowns going around, given that such density of your deck and some of your stickier cards as well happen to be like 2 drops. The Schooner is also pretty poorly facing into Preachers right now. just kind of more grind values, removal with hard-hitting question, artifact enchantment hate, kind of counter spell effects, cryptic coat for unblockable, plays really nice with all the buffs, Tishana's Tidebinder for activated abilities, kind of mixed into there. Continuing on our journey, Esper Mid, another deck that's got a number of different variations, but at the core it has similar effects, but basically Rafine decks have been powerful for some time. Cheap removal, counter spells mixed into here, your 2-drop package, Fairy Mastermind, Thrall, Denic, Bats. Notably, Thrall does shut off your own bat, so just keep that in mind. But like you have your wedding announcements in here, the core of the deck, Rafine, attack, connive, find whatever thing you need. A lot of grind value in that case. Virtues on your top end. Lets you tap on tap. Alcazat's in here. Some Emperors as well. Notably no Shelly in this version, but you might see Shieldred in some. And then just, again, because you're super flexible, you can shift up more controlling. You can shift down to be more aggressive. A lot of different removal counters. Planeswalker grind value. Lauren for artifact enchantment hate. All kind of mixed into there. Again, literally just put one Unlicensed Hearse in your sideboard. Between the Invoke Crimes decks, the Mentor decks, all these kind of graveyard-centric decks that look to kind of take advantage of like lands, you'll be happy to have it. You'd rather not use it, but if you do, you'll be happy to have. Like, you'll feel more upset when not having it. Bant Toxic. This one is 59%. So leveraging a lot of the powerful lands between Myrex and the Seed Core. This version of the deck is looking to get 10 poison counters on your opponent. Cheap threats, you got the Venerated Rot Priest, Skrull for protection, Crawling Course as well. Jawbone Duelist can put multiple poison counters on your opponent through Double Strike, Skrull's Hive to make you a bunch of bodies, gain you life once they're corrupted. You have Fading Hope as tempo, March of Swirling Mist for protection, Serum Snare as a bounce effect interaction that proliferates. Binding as counters, Charge of Mites as both removal or as just way instant speed to make creatures. Then you also have Mindlink Mech that could become a copy of any of your creatures, and then it's still a 4/3 flyer, so it creates a level of evasion. So say Jawbone Duelist, this becomes a 4/3 double strike flying, which is pretty sweet, just to push through more damage. Sideboard, just counter spells. You have Doorkeeper Thrall for ETB effects. Notably, this does not shut off temporary lockdown. What you probably want is what's it called? Pick your poison, just a way to force them to sacrifice enchantments or just some sort of enchantment removal. You can go Destroy Evil is often played as well. I would probably play that in some number in the sideboard. You have a lot of counters here, but I feel like somewhere in the 75 you want Destroy Evil in the particular list as well. So something just to keep in mind as you're building the deck. This sideboard does need Destroy Evil, I think. So this version of Gruul Aggro is mono red, splash some green cards. Kind of sweet one. This was a prowess list. So a lot of the elements of the mono red deck, a little bit softer, obviously to temporary lockdowns and speed removal, but kind of a prowessy shell, slide red. You have Swiss Spears, Cacophony Scamp, which can be then sacked to throw damage, Anger for trample, Monstrous Rage for pumps and trample, Fugitive Codebreaker. In this deck, so I don't think Fugitive Codebreaker is great in the stock mono red list. This version, because there's a lot more pump effects, it's reasonable, but I played a lot with it in the mono red, and I'm going to go back to Adversary in that version. Some Feldons in there, Questing Druid for card advantage. Case is very, very good. I highly recommend this in your red-based aggro decks, and then some copies of Witchstalker Friendly. This version as well. Then you have like End the Festivities for like the go wide decks. Pick Your Poison is very good against lockdowns, against Traxxas, stuff like that. Urbrass Forge, very good in the grindier matchups, and then Bolts, Lithomantic Barrage's removal, and then Boseiju itself. If you can support it, so this version of the deck, probably don't want it because you have smaller creatures. In mono red, because you typically in like the more aggressive matchups shift to more mid-range control and win off Forge, that's usually how I approach it. Vampire's Vengeance is better than End of Festivities because Festivities quickly get scaled out once they have a War Leader's Call or an Anthem effect, or against Wedding Announcement decks, it's also pretty easy for them to scale it as well. Vampire's Vengeance deals 2 damage. It's much better against a lot of the token decks. It deals 2 damage, goes a lot further than the 1 damage. Then we go to the Slogurk deck. So it's got a 50% win rate. This deck is hard to play. It might have slowly been hated out, but it did win the Chicago PT. So not the Pro Tour was Pioneer, but there was a $75,000 standard tournament. This list won. So the kind of concept of the deck, you are playing the Capenna fetch lands. So they sack, you gain a life, and it looks for a basic, puts into play. You'll notice a larger number of basics. You'll also notice a number of the channel lands. They're putting lands into your graveyard, and then you'll cast Aftermath Analyst. It mills, put more cards in your graveyard. With the Analyst, you can then sack it and then kind of pseudo ramp. You get back all those lands. If you have something like Nissa Resurgent, it then lets you get all that value back because every landfall generates mana. The second landfall per turn also fetches you an elf, which either gets you Nissa or Aftermath Analyst. You basically will get to a point where you could generate huge amounts of mana by sacking and kind of bringing things back. Even when these don't find lands, they enter the battlefield and then go to the graveyard. So you with Nissa, what you're basically going to do is with like Slogurks out and Takanumas, you can keep looping Takanumas with enough mana to get back Aftermath Analyst to keep generating mana. The Slogurk, you remove counters, and then you get Takanumas back, and then with Nissa, you generate more mana, and then you'll eventually just get Jaces in play, and then mill out your opponent that way there. You can also just win with a big Slogurk crashing in, or Traxa. Terratide as a sweeper. Celeste is kind of in there, Path to Peril sweepers. Sideboards just like removal, hand hate, more Jaces, some more Besejus for enchantment hate kind of mixed into there. And then lastly, mono red aggro. This is my list. There's a couple other lists. So kind of the concept right now, I think if you want to play this deck, you need to be on some numbers of cases main. I was playing 3, you can do 2. In the 3-drop spot, I think just playing Squee is sufficient. You look at some of the mono red decks right now, I don't think Godric is good right now. It forces you to play more in 3/3 on its base. There's a lot of 4 toughness. It needs to get flying to be able to do anything, but then often just gets hit by a dedicated removal spell. Squeeze, much stickier of a threat. It keeps coming back. And on its own, it's just like an engine. They need to answer it or you kind of run away with the game. The case is very good in the deck. The biggest thing with mono red is you run out of card advantage in game 1, so this kind of keeps putting value. Charming Scoundrel, very good. Fugitive Codebreaker, we tried it out. Honestly, I don't think this card is good in mono red, and the reason being, so on turn 2, you play this out. It's a 2/1. Well, how many 1/1s are in this format? There's a bunch of 1/1 flyers. The Convoke decks are making a bunch of 1/1 attackers, Wedding Announcement. So now your 2-drop is like trading for a third of a 1-drop, which just feels terrible. The Disguise is 3 mana, do nothing for the turn it comes down. In the deck, it's very telegraphed in terms of what it is. The Disguise also gets hit by Temporary Lockdown. It gets hit by March for 0 because it's 0 CMC. It's very heavy mana intensive to actually activate for the Disguise. Whereas the Adversary comes down with haste, it's a 2/2 at least. Late game, gets you the immediate value. It gets bigger over time as well. And it just kind of fits your curve better, I think. So I'm going to switch back to that. I went 3 Phoenix Chick. It plays nicely with the case. You can discard it, get it back. Similarly, but I don't want multiple copies because it's usually the weakest 1-drop. Similarly, a lot of the meta is cut downs, like a lot of cheap removal. Monstrous Rage, while very strong, you don't want to draw multiples, especially against control, stuff like that, because it opens you up to get 2 for 1. So 3 copies was kind of my sweet spot. 3 Bushstalker's Frenzies in the main. You could do a 3/1 split of Intrepid Adversary, and if you want, so I'd play 3 Bloodthirsty Adversary, I always say Intrepid, and then 1 Feldon. Like, this is what's upset. Like, why are you playing 4 Feldons? They're legendary. It doesn't make sense. Kind of mixed into there. Just poorly crafted in, like, assortment of cards. Kind of in there. The other take I have is Myrex is much better right now in mono red than playing Mishra's Foundry. So the most common creature land you're likely going to run into is the blue-white one, which is a 2/3 body. There's just a lot of creatures that easily hit Mishra's Foundry. Mishra's Foundry doesn't attack for much and exposes you for that. The Myrex lets you just kind of keep putting pressure on your opponent. It can get around life gain because you put Toxic. It gives you multiple bodies as well. So it's less of an investment in the sense that you're not committing your whole turn to just kind of poke for 2 damage. It lets you kind of put pressure without committing more to the board and exposing your land to removal. I really liked Myrex in the list. The sideboard, what I would do, especially with switching to the adversaries, because they're vampires, you can go up the number of copies of Vampire's Vengeance. I would probably go up to the second copy of the Vampire's Vengeance and then just trim to 1 End the Festivities. I may entirely cut the End the Festivities and play 2 of these and then 1 Planeswalker, whether Koth or Chandra, just against control, just to have another threat included there. The Obliterating Bolts are needed against the kind of domain decks for toughness. They're exile based as well, which comes in handy a lot of times. There's a lot of recursive threats, but kind of the core is against all these mid-rangey control decks. You bring in Erebras Forge. It kind of takes over pretty much almost every match. I bring in Erebras Forge because your opponents tend to kind of board accordingly, and then it brings in a lot of damage. Against low to the ground creature decks, I think people often approach it wrong. Against Convoke, you should become the control deck in that matchup. Against Toxic, you should become that control deck. So what I do is I remove a lot of the cheaper creatures, like the Monstrous Rage, stuff like that. Sometimes trim on the Kumanos. And Kumano's actually good against Toxic because it gets rid of, like, it exiles. But what you do there is you just literally rely on Forge is going to be my win condition. It's just going to sit here and keep putting out attackers. I'll have Case to refill my hand. And then every other card in my deck is just going to kill whatever they play. And then you just kind of win that route there. So you end up playing that longer game. I think people think at times like, this is a mono red aggro deck, I have to play aggro. My method of winning is aggro. But it's important to know, like, are you the beatdown in certain matchups and creature decks? Similarly, against like the Esper deck, I kind of shift, have more interaction, get rid of some of the cheaper threats that don't attack well into some of their creatures. So that is my thoughts of mono red. I have 7 rounds of gameplay of mono red, like 3 hours of this. If you want to see sideboard decisions, how I approach, played pretty much every one of the top decks in the tournament, so you can see the Toxic matchups, the domain matchups. There's a lot of control matchups. If you want to see me get dumpstered by Golgari in the last round, that's there too. But I'm going to wrap this up. Let me know what you think of the video. Good luck to everyone participating. I will try to jam as many games as possible too. Have a good one. Stay safe out there. Thanks for watching.